subprime borrowers start to default. And by October 2007, 3% of all US home loans are in the foreclosure process, with another 7% 1 month past due. Mortgage investments are starting to turn into real estate, and investment banks are flooding the market with foreclosed homes. Soon enough, supply is starting to outpace demand, and in 2008, housing prices do something that nobody prepared for. They start to free fall. And so begins the domino effect that was the 2008 financial crisis. Finance companies involved in the real estate game take a hit. And despite 75% of CDOs receiving the highest safety rating, 70% of them default. Investment banks, seeing the carnage they've caused, stop buying mortgages from lenders, and the insurers find themselves facing impossible payouts. Banks, lenders, and insurers start to shut down. And despite the government trying to save the largest players from the brink of destruction, on September 15th, we see the largest bankruptcy in US history, as Lehman Brothers, an investment bank with $600 billion in assets, goes under. At this point, anyone with money to spare pulls it out of the markets and places it into treasury bonds, which leads the Dow Jones to lose a third of its value. And companies relying on loans to operate suddenly lose access to vital financing. Countries with ties to the US are caught up in the disaster too. And by 2009, the global economic engine stalls. 2 million American jobs would be lost in the last 4 months of 2008 alone. And while the recession would technically end in June 2009, the impact of the crisis would be felt for long afterwards. And the kicker to it all, despite financial institutions causing the whole disaster, they received the most money from the government's rescue attempts. While the Dodd-Frank Act would be introduced in 2010 to crack down on the lending practices of financial institutions, one would hope that we never again need regulation to remind us that greed should never trump common sense and decency.
Of the English idiom, kick the can down the road. To kick the can down the road means to avoid or delay dealing with a problem, especially by using a short-term solution in the hopes that a final solution will become someone else's problem.
Whoever has the ball, the potato is out. Okay?
Hot potato, 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 hot
It refers not only to trying to ignore a problem, but to continually enacting stopgap or band-aid solutions so as to defer a final and definitive action, often because of political ramifications.
And this is a very serious headline for you to pay attention to. The United Nations is now urging our Fed to pause interest rate hikes on the fears of a global recession. Now, Jerome Powell has been absolutely firm that he is not going to reverse his position on raising interest rates in order to lower inflation. However, in recent light of what the UK just experienced with their pension plans and seeing how they ultimately reversed their course, we don't know. So if you don't know what happened in the UK, here's the breakdown.
The Bank of England was the first major central bank to blink in this global game of chicken. The Bank of England has already pivoted and has returned to quantitative easing. Now, this is very significant because up until yesterday, the governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, he was just as hawkish as Jerome Powell. He was talking tough about how resolute the Bank of England was to fighting inflation. They've got the highest inflation in Europe. It's way above their 2% target. It's a double-digit number. It's above 10%. And so Bailey was committed to bringing down inflation. He even said, no matter the cost, I'm willing to endure some pain, just like Jerome Powell was saying. Well, that was all a bluff because we got some pain overnight and Bailey folded like a cheap suit, and instead of quantitative tightening, they're back to quantitative easing. The rate hikes are probably permanently on hold because the Bank of England refused to allow a potential crisis to unfold as a result of rising interest rates. And the crisis manifests itself in the UK pension system. See, the problem that pensions have had all around the world, this is not a situation isolated to the United Kingdom. So you're going to have these type of problems everywhere, including the United States. you have a lot of these defined benefit pensions where the pensions are obligated to pay out the pensioners certain amounts of money for the rest of their lives after they retire. Well, what pensions typically do is they invest a lot of money in bonds, and then they take the income from their bond portfolios and they use that income to meet their pension obligations. Well, what do you do when the central banks bring interest rates down to zero and you can barely get any income on your bonds? How do you match your liabilities with your assets when your assets are barely throwing off any income? Well, the way a lot of these British pension funds solve that problem is they leverage their easy way out, but the very reckless way out of borrowing money. And everything was working fine until it started a free fall. It went to a new all-time record low. It traded below $1.04, and yield started to spike. In fact, as of yesterday, yield on 30-year British gilts was up to about 5%. And what was happening is the pension funds were getting margin calls on all the money they had borrowed. And so they were going to be forced to sell their gilts into a depressed market. That would have crashed the market. Great Britain was looking at a potential crash in the bond market, which would have sent yields soaring even more, and everything would have imploded. And so to prevent that financial crisis, the Bank of England folded. They pivoted. They decided to launch a new QE program. Remember, they were committed to quantitative tightening. Now they said they will buy whatever it takes. They have now committed to another QE infinity in order to prop up the bond market. They now have to print British pounds to buy these gilts. And so instead of fighting inflation, which yesterday was public enemy number one, it had to be brought down at any cost. Now, all of a sudden, when you see the cost, well, forget about that. We're now going to create inflation, because that is what the Bank of England is doing. They are now creating inflation. Now, they went out of their way to try to hide behind what just happened by saying, well, this is not a monetary policy decision, meaning we didn't decide to do it because we wanted to. We had to avoid a crisis. But of course, it is a monetary policy decision because that's the only policy they make. Deciding to launch QE is monetary policy. I don't care what you want to pretend. And so inflation won. The British people now have got to accept reality that inflation is here to stay. Not just regular inflation, but extremely high inflation. It's not going to go away. The Bank of England has already made that choice.